hope everybody had a lovely lunch. If I can ask everyone to take a seat and settle, start on time. Thank you. Thank you. So we are delighted this afternoon to be able to start the afternoon by presenting 2 of our 9 researcher-led projects from our Breeding for Better Welfare theme, which is building a body of evidence on welfare around breeding in companion and farm animals. So I'd firstly like to introduce Huw O'Connell, who is going to talk about developing appropriate environmental enrichment strategies for broiler breeders. Thank you, Huw.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. So we were focusing on broiler breeders, so these are the parents of our broiler, our meat chickens, and our work was really focused on the production phase, where you've got males and females housed together to produce fertile hatching eggs, and we were working with them between about 19 and 63 weeks of age in environments that look something like this. So this is Mary Baxter and I outside one of the houses. Mary took all of the measures on the study, and I was her bodyguard. So I was there to protect her from the lively males as she took her measures. It was a first opportunity for us to work with broiler breeders in our group, and really appreciated the opportunity to get to know these beautiful personality-filled birds, and also to get to understand the management system a little bit better. They are the subject of remarkably little research. So if you do a quick scan on Scopus or any literature database, you'll find about 9 papers on environmental enrichment for broiler breeders. Of these, 4 are actual experimental studies. Of these 4, 2 involve birds during the production phase, and of these 2, one of them is the study that I'm going to talk about today. So we have virtually nothing to base any policy decisions on in relation to enrichment for these birds. Just for comparison, with broiler chickens, we've got about 92 papers, and pigs, we've got about 255. So this research was really about trying to fill that gap. It was a 2-year study. In the first year, we conducted preference tests to try to understand their preferences for different perch types, pecking objects, and dust bathing materials. We worked on 1 farm with 4 houses, each of which had about 8,000 birds. In house 1, we had 3 different perch types installed across the production cycle. In house 4, we had 3 different pecking objects installed across the production cycle, 3 different types of pecking objects. In house 2, we had both the perch types and pecking objects, and in house 3, it was an unenriched control. So this was predominantly a preference study, but we also wanted to understand if there was any overt negative effects on productivity of having, and on welfare, of having enrichment in the house and of level of enrichment. In year 2, we then went on to look at the impact of having access to preferred enrichments. So we worked on 3 farms in year 2, 2 houses on each farm. One of them was enriched with the preferred perch type and pecking object, and the other was unenriched, and we assessed welfare and performance across the production cycle. I'm only going to talk about year 1 today, and that's also just been published in scientific reports. So in terms of perch types, we looked at platform perches. The pictures actually look quite small up there. So we had platform perches, we had a bar perch, and we had a rubber-covered bar perch. And we had 2 of each type of perch installed over the nesting platforms on either side of the houses in the 2 houses that had perch types. And we assessed the use of the perches in early lay, in peak lay, and in late lay. And we got very clear findings when you did the preference tests. At each stage, the birds showed a very strong preference for using platform perches over bar perches. Within the bar perches, they preferred rubber-covered rather than metal bars. And of course, across the laying cycle, you saw a general decline in use of the perch. These were 3-meter perches in all cases, and we were also interested in understanding how much perch space should be provided to the birds, and trying to understand it on the basis of the birds' behaviour as opposed to their physical dimensions. So Mary looked at, produced a histogram really of perch usage by the birds, and saw that generally after about 13 birds on this 3-meter perch, you see a kind of a drop-off in use. So this seems to be their voluntary occupancy rate. And that's what it looks like. If you see the 13 birds lined up on the platform perch at nighttime there, that's what they choose, the density they choose to show on those perches. So we would recommend that they are provided with 23 centimetres of linear perch space based on their behaviour on the perches. In terms of pecking objects, we used gazing balls, and we used reflective gazing balls, non-reflective, and reflective and coloured gazing balls. And we had 2 of each type on each side of the house in each of 2 houses. And again, we looked at the use and generally actual physical contact with these pecking balls in early, peak, and in late lay. And what we found was actually there was quite a bit more engagement than we had expected. The birds really did use these enrichments, particularly in the early part of the lay cycle, and then it declined across the cycle. We didn't see any strong preferences in terms of physical contact, but we think we probably missed a trick because there was actually a lot of non-physical contact with these gazing balls, and the birds were actually gazing at themselves quite a bit in the reflective balls. So we built that into year 2 to actually measure visual contact with the enrichment as well as physical contact. With the dust bathing substrate, we looked at providing them with discrete dust baths with fresh sawdust, with oat hulls, or with a mixture of oat hulls and sawdust during peak lay and late lay. But generally, we found that if there was a foraging substrate within the dust bathing material, then the males just dominated it, and the females didn't really get to use it. But generally, there wasn't a huge amount of dust bathing because they were housed on deep litter, and so they dust bathed in the house quite a lot. So they didn't need additional dust bathing substrates. We were quite interested in understanding, just generally, as I said, is there any particular negative effect of having enrichments in the house? We don't have any replication here. We just have 4 houses. Again, that looks quite small, but generally what we found was that when we looked at things like mortality, egg production, the percentage of floor eggs, that across all of our 4 houses, they were all within normal commercial norms, so nothing significantly bad about providing the enrichment. But actually we found some benefits. In the house that had both types of enrichment, there was numerically better egg production and numerically lower mortality, but also unfortunately numerically a higher percentage of floor eggs. We also looked at feather coverage across the different houses. The higher the score, the poorer the feather coverage on the birds, and as you might expect, this increased across the production cycle. No big differences between treatments, but slightly poorer feather score or slightly better feather score in the control treatment at peak lay. So just to finish off, we have completed the year 2 data collection. So in year 2, we provided the birds with platform perches in the house and also with reflective gazing balls together across the production cycle. And we assessed performance and welfare. The analysis is ongoing, but certainly the data so far would suggest there's no negative effects on bird productivity or health associated with having enrichments in the house. So there isn't a commercial reason not to include these enrichments in the houses. The birds, however, have consistently shown engagement with these enrichments across both years of our study, so there is a welfare reason to include them. Quite rewarding for us is the fact that the farmers have actually maintained and kept the platform perches on those 3 farms after the end of the study. They saw the benefits and they wanted to retain them. So that's just to show you. In one of the farms, you can see the birds up on the perch there and has remained in the house. So just wanted to finish by acknowledging the Animal Welfare Foundation for their funding and just have been an excellent organisation for us to work with. To thank Moy Park and Pilgrims Europe for allowing us access to these breeder farms, and also to thank the farmers just for educating us and entertaining us and putting up with us for a couple of years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Huw, for a great presentation. We do have some time for questions. Are there any questions on the floor? No? Oh, sorry. Yeah, one just there. Do we have a roving mic? Oh, here we are. Could you pop your hand up again? Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah Alexander, APHA. Thank you for your talk. With the birds, that's great that you're thinking they would like a platform perch, but what would be your recommendations per 1,000 birds? How much perch? Because clearly there's not lots of perch from your photograph.
So we provided them with 4.5 metres of perch space per 1,000 birds. The current recommendation for broiler chickens is 2 metres of perch space per 1,000 birds, so we were more than double what the current sort of industry standard is. At that level of provision, they weren't always fully occupied. So the platform perch was obviously the most occupied, but it was about, on average, about 70% occupied at night time. So I don't think we were lacking in terms of perch space. They weren't completely full so that no other birds could use them. So I would suggest about the level that we had provided, somewhere certainly above 2 metres per 1,000 birds, but closer to the 4.5 metres that we had provided.
There's another question, just thanks.
Thank you. Jane Downs, Animal Welfare Committee. Did you find any benefits to them? So was there improvements in other areas of animal welfare, such as aggression, pecking, better laying?
That's the focus of year 2. So that analysis is ongoing. This first year was a preference study just to understand which types of enrichment they preferred to engage with. And obviously we saw that they showed quite a bit of engagement, which would suggest that their welfare is improved by having access to those resources. Year 2, we're looking in more detail at aggression, at mating behaviour, at other things that's important to the industry as well, like hatchability of the eggs, as well as egg production. So there's a much wider range of measures taken in year 2, where we have more replication. We have 3 farms, so we'll just have to wait and see how that, the analysis, what it shows us.
So there was no negativity found in year 1, and that's why you...
There's no negative effects found, no.
Thank you. There's one question on slide, Doni, if I can take that one. Why do you think the chickens found the great gazing balls so interesting, given that they are with many conspecifics all the time? Solitary pet birds with mirrors.
I think there's something about a reflective, and we know that poultry are attracted to reflective substrates. I think the fact that it is always changing, you know, the light environment is continually changing, and the reflections are continually changing on those gazing balls. So they're stimulating to look at, probably more stimulating, you know, than just looking at other birds, which they do all the time. So I think that is what has attracted them. And as I say, we found more that there was actually an awful lot of visual contact, more so than well, not more so, but at least on a par with the physical contact. So I think they're visually interesting to the birds. So it's certainly something that we're going to try now across different types of poultry as well.
Thank you. I've got one more question from the floor there.
Hello, Nikki Trevorrow from Cats Protection. So forgive my questions, but with the gazing ball, do you think they'd like one of those things that creates rainbows? Do you know the ones I mean? Do you know the ones I mean? You can put them in the window and then they catch the light and they can sort of put rainbows around. Whether they might like that. And with the dust bath, if they were given more space, do you think they might use them if they had more space?
If they were given more space, that they might have used it. Well, I'll take that one first. Possibly. We could only provide the dust baths for a limited period in the house because there was concern about just disrupting the management flow within the house. So certainly when they were provided, they were descended upon quite quickly, and the material sort of moved out or consumed. So it would have been very difficult in the rush to use the dust baths to actually dust bathe in them. But as I say, they were largely superfluous because there was really deep bedding in that house, and we could see them dust bathing in groups all around the house. So I don't think they needed additional dust bathing material. I don't think it's necessary. Unlike with broiler chickens, with broiler breeders, the bedding does that for them. In relation to the rainbow effect, that is something that I am thinking about for broiler chickens in terms of manipulating the light that comes into the house and the quality of it. It's so hugely important to poultry. And yes, there's an awful lot of scope to look at that type of enrichment.
Thank you, Niamh. If you can join me in thanking Niamh. And I'm now pleased to introduce Lindsay Henderson, who's going to talk about her research, Light During Incubation, a significant and understudied welfare challenge for poultry.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here to speak today. Early life conditions matter. They affect growth, individuals' growth, their health, and their behaviour. And these impacts can last into adulthood. So today I'm going to be talking about how early life interventions can influence behaviour and potentially enhance the welfare of layer poultry. So first of all, why focus on early life interventions in layers? Well, poultry are the most numerous farmed animal globally, and in the UK alone there's over 40 million layer hens reared each year. Hens lay from about 6 months old and they can continue to be productive for up to 2 years. So interventions in early life that can have benefits for welfare throughout life could be incredibly important. In commercial settings, eggs are incubated under complete darkness. But that's unlike natural incubation conditions where eggs experience a light-dark cycle when the hen gets up and leaves and returns to the nest. So how might light, I should be clicking along with what I'm saying. So how might light during incubation benefit welfare? There has been quite a few studies looking at how light during incubation can affect various aspects. First of which being productivity. There is evidence that light during incubation can enhance embryo development and post-hatch growth. There's also a number of studies, particularly from Leslie Rogers, who's looked at how light during incubation can affect neural development in birds. In particular, the development of the eye, but also the development of functional lateralization. That's when the different hemispheres of the brain can specialize in different tasks. Behaviorally, the main traits that have been seen to be affected by light during incubation is a reduction in fear responses and a reduction in stress responses in birds. But there are still gaps remaining in this research, particularly understanding how light during incubation could affect positive behavioural indicators of welfare, like interaction with enrichment that's provided post-hatch. So in our experiment, we investigated 2 early life interventions. The first was light exposure during incubation, and the second was provision of dark shelters post-hatch. And we used white leghorn chicks, which are a commercial laying breed. We used a 4x4 factorial design, so we had 2 treatments for the light during incubation. Some eggs were incubated under constant low-intensity light, and eggs were incubated under complete darkness. After hatching, chicks then went under 2 different post-hatching enrichment strategies, either standard housing. This is an example of our pens here, which had constant access to food and water and deep litter, and pens that had the provision of a dark shelter enrichment, which under this conditions is a cardboard box with 2 entrance holes that allows the chicks to go in and rest undisturbed. So this resulted in 4 different treatment groups that allowed us to look at both the individual and the combined effects of our treatments of incubation, light, and post-hatch enrichment. So we observed the behaviour of the chicks for 4 weeks post-hatch, and we used a scan sampling approach. So we stop the video observation and record the behaviour that each individual bird is doing. The behaviours are based upon a predefined ethogram. From previous research, we expected to see main behaviours we expected to see from our scan sampling were foraging. Chicks are incredibly motivated to forage within the first few days of life, in the first 4 weeks, and resting behaviours. Chicks in the early stages still show a lot of resting behaviour in the first few weeks. And our scan sampling approach did capture these broad activity patterns. We also wanted to try and capture comfort behaviours, which are maintenance behaviours in birds that help them protect their feathers, but they're also seen mostly when birds are not stressed and free of other stressors. So they're a good indication of positive welfare. But the scanning method that we used, we recorded the comfort behaviours too rarely. So we weren't able to address that initially. So we first focused on looking to see whether our treatments affected broad activity patterns, specifically overall activity, foraging and resting behaviours. So our main findings, I'll just describe these graphs initially as well because I realise they're a little bit busy. So on the y-axis is the proportion of time recorded doing the behaviours, and on the x-axis we have the 4 weeks where we observe behaviour. For eggs, the chicks whose eggs, when they were in the egg, they were incubated under light or dark, for our 2 housing treatments, which either was a control treatment or included the provision of a dark shelter. So if we initially look at the first week, what we found was that chicks in the control pens that were incubated under light had significantly higher levels of activity and foraging behaviour. And this is resting behaviour that I'm putting up, and this one is exactly the same layout as the previous graphs. And on the other side of that, we found that the birds were resting more. But overall, what we found was that the provision of the dark shelter reduced overall activity levels in foraging and increased resting behaviour. And we actually found this effect was more consistent over the 4 weeks and more significant when the chicks had been incubated under light compared to darkness. So importantly, these initial findings suggest that incubating eggs with some light can enhance the benefits of enrichment post-hatch. One thing that I didn't mention before was that if the birds were observed in the shelter, we automatically recorded them as resting. But we realised after the fact that we should probably validate that they were resting, so we put in nest box cameras in the final cohort of birds that we ran to actually look to see what the birds were doing when they were in there. And the majority of behaviours that they were doing were, in fact, inactive, and primarily they were resting when they were in there. When the birds were resting, they were doing it for longer as well. So well over a minute for our behavioural observations. If the birds were in there for more than a minute, we assumed they were resting. And when we looked to see what they were doing in the boxes, they were indeed resting for much longer periods in the box, and all the other behaviours that they were doing in there were much shorter. So we were confident that the assumption that we'd made was validated and confirmed. So to summarise our findings so far, effects of lighting during incubation seems to affect overall activity levels within the first week of life, and there's a strong interaction with post-hatch enrichment. So birds that, with post-hatch enrichment overall increased resting behaviour. Resting behaviour is important because previous studies that have looked at the effects of dark shelters or dark brooders have also found increased levels of resting in poultry, layer poultry and broilers. And that's been linked to reduced incidence of feather pecking and other negative behaviours. And our main finding really was that lighted incubation seems to enhance the impact of the enrichment that we're using post-hatch. So we have ongoing work, so because we're looking at broad activity levels, we also want to look at other aspects of behaviour which will be maybe indicative of positive affect in the birds. So we're using the video observations we've already taken, we're using continuous observations to quantify comfort behaviours, play behaviour and also aggressive behaviours to see whether we can build an evidence base that the enrichment is also enhancing positive behaviours and not just increasing resting. So We hope overall that these findings lay a groundwork for further research that can help develop early life interventions for layer poultry that can then be applied to commercial settings as well. And that just leaves me to thank the co-PI, Simone Medal. Also, this work was conducted at the National Avian Research Facility at the Roslin Institute, and Louisa Cosin and Emily O'Hara were students who helped with some of the behavioural work, and Helen Brown, who helped with the statistical work on this. And just thanks to the Animal Welfare Foundation for having me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Any questions from the floor? No? I don't have any questions on Slido, but thank you so much. That was a great update, and people can catch you, I'm sure, if they have any questions later. Thank you, Lindsay. So I'm now going to pass over to Beth for our next session.
Thank you very much. And I think those talks have set us up really nicely for our panel discussion we're going to have this afternoon, thinking about farm animal welfare, economics and social licence. So I'm going to wear two hats this afternoon. I'm both going to chair this session, but I'm also going to be speaking as well, so I need to remember to time myself. And before I kick off, I think I'm going to get you guys to do a little bit of work. So we have 3 questions for you this afternoon. So if we could have the first question up on the Slido, so thinking about who is good animal welfare for? Sorry for jumping ahead, just means you can't cheat and look at some of our slides. Oh. There seems to be some fairly universal thoughts on this one. Thinking about the animals, everyone, humanity. We've got some other stakeholders going on in there as well. It's an oxymoron, that's a nice one. That's a nice one. Yeah. Recognizing that role humans have in there too. That's great. So, we might wrap this one up thinking about time, but our second question is getting you to think a bit more. So if we're thinking about good animal existing, who should be paying for this, or who should be absorbing the costs? And this will hopefully set the 3 of us up very nicely for our discussion. So, a lot of consumers cropping up there. More philosophical question coming in. I feel that's potentially beyond my scope, but I would be very keen to put that back to the floor. Yeah, thinking very all-encompassing as well this time, thinking who should pay. And then we're finally going to touch on our last question, at least for the beginning of the session. Who should profit from good animal welfare? This is where having non-anonymous polls would have been really useful for thinking, putting me on there. So everybody, animals and farmers. Yeah, some, no one, it's a nice mix. Businesses, because that drives progress. So quite a range of different responses that we've got going on here. And again, I think that's definitely giving us some food for thought, if you excuse the pun, for thinking about what we're going to talk about for the next hour or so. So if we could switch back to my slides, that's brilliant, thank you. So I think you might need to go a bit higher up. Brilliant. So just to give a bit of background about myself, I'm Beth. I work up at Newcastle University, and I'm a social scientist who's really interested in human behaviour and human behaviour change surrounding farm animals, in particular animal production and animal consumption, and I work with a range of different stakeholders across the food chain. I'm delighted to chair the session today with myself, Neil and James, who I'll introduce shortly in the beginning of their talks. And what we're really here to think about is thinking about some of the economic impacts of animal welfare improvements. So thinking about the costs involved, are they good for business or are they potentially challenging for business with those costs? Thinking about livestock's social license to operate, and we've heard a lot about social license across the different sessions today, and thinking about who is being taken into account within that as well, so recognising the range of different views, and that has cropped up in some of your responses to those questions, so that's great. Thinking about what does good welfare mean, and then also thinking about who is good welfare for, which again, you've given us some really nice pointers for discussion and hopefully thought for questions going forward for the rest of the afternoon. So I'm going to briefly go through thinking about a few different stakeholder perspectives in relation to the question, economic, social license, and farm animal welfare. And this is largely based off two research projects that I've undertaken recently. So Field, a much bigger project that looked at farmers, vets, and consumers' perspectives of animal welfare and endemic livestock disease, and a more recent Animal Welfare Foundation funded project, which my colleague Niamh is going to talk a lot more about this afternoon, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But I think what we can all agree is that farmers don't intentionally set out to have poor welfare. We know that very often when there are more severe cases of poor welfare in existence, this is largely due to other factors, sometimes awfully largely beyond their control. So it could be things to do with different personal circumstances and events that have happened. We also know from our research that there are a lot of challenges sometimes to changing practices or behaviours. So they're not always due to knowledge or education, which we've heard about in relation to companion animals, but also thinking about some of the maybe physical barriers or opportunities to things. Could be the weather, it could be costs, but also thinking about some of the social opportunities or challenges. And as a result of these, there's a lot of options or support put forward that hopefully drive change or positive welfare improvements. And one thing I think it's really important to note within this is thinking about the role of the vet. And we know from across the different projects and to thinking across different species, the role of the vet is really important here, both in terms of building up relationships with their clients, thinking about the animals, and being able to feed in a broad perspective of different solutions, just because of the fact that they see a range of different enterprises going forward. I also spend a lot of time talking to the public and consumers as well, and there's a large and growing body of research out there that shows that the public largely have or view good welfare as important. So they place a lot of emphasis on this. They are concerned both for the animals' welfare, so they have kind of an altruistic understanding that animals should have a good life, but they're also rather selfishly driven by their own well-being as well. So there's lots of evidence to suggest that higher welfare products could be viewed as safer or potentially better for consumers than those from different welfare standards. What we also know is that there's a large gap between the level of concern that people show and their actual willingness to pay for these higher welfare products. And consumers cropped up a lot when thinking about who should pay. But we know that there's lots of reasons why that isn't always the case. We also know that the modern consumer is also increasingly distanced from livestock production. So it's increasingly removed from public view. We don't always have access to knowledge about it. It can be quite closed off sometimes. And that leads us to considerations of the meat paradox. So do consumers actually want more information or more familiarity with how livestock are raised? And I have a few different quotes to show you on this. from some of our focus groups that we've done with consumers. So from the top one you can see up on the slide, this is very much thinking about a more kind of ignorance is bliss approach. So I think that cropped up right at the very beginning of today's session, actually cropped up in a couple of our focus groups as well. So thinking about that, consumers kind of don't want to know, they don't want to necessarily think about where their food has come from because that might potentially put them off from eating it, and they like continue as they are. After all, we're all creatures of habit. The second quote is from a different focus group, different consumer, but very much the opposite view. So thinking that, well, actually, they would really like to have more information, think about knowing what's going on into their farm, potentially more information on standards, because they don't want to feel like they're contributing to stopping, or they don't want to think they're contributing to certain standards or certain conditions still existing in practice. I think that just kind of shows you the kind of broad views that are out there, but also kind of a wide interest in talking about animal welfare as a subject as well. So just to kind of think about finishing off with some future directions, and again, reinforcing some food for thought with all this. So if we're thinking about changes to animal welfare going forward, and obviously having positive changes, thinking more about good welfare and what it is and how we can achieve it. So thinking about how are these changes implemented? Is it policy? Is it incremental? Is it business standards, for example? Thinking about whose views are taking into account within this. So we've heard a lot about giving a voice to the animal over today, but should there, or who else should be involved? And thinking about what support is needed and given to help others change their practices and change their behaviours as well. So, if we can go on to Neil's slides, that'll be amazing. So I'm going to hand over to Neil Hudson now. So Neil has worked in mixed veterinary practice and academia, both in the UK and overseas. He's an RCVS diplomate in equine internal medicine, a fellow of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, and a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He sat on the Commons EFRA Select Committee from 2020 to 2024, is chair of the APPG for Animal Welfare, and is the first vet to be elected to the House of Commons since 1984. He's currently Member of Parliament for Epping Forest and a shadow DEFRA Minister with Animal Health and Welfare and Biosecurity in his brief. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you very much to the conference organisers for the kind invitation to speak to you today. The observant of you will note that I'm a Cambridge graduate, so that's to put some balance in the programme after the RVC domination of this morning's session. And this photo here actually was donated to me by the late Martin Weaver, and that's a picture of Cambridge Vet School. And if I just, in my completely unbiased view, Cambridge Vet School is facing a lot of challenges moving forward, and I think it's absolutely pivotal for the future of veterinary medicine and science and education in the UK and around the world, and animal health and welfare, that institution carries on. Anyway, that's my party political broadcast done now. So my job today is to talk to you a bit about the political and legislative perspective in terms of animal health and welfare and the social licence and economics. And there's significant challenges facing the UK and global farming sectors. We've got to very much protect farm animal health and welfare, but also in the One Health perspective, we've got to support human health and welfare with that. And I noted that one of the word clouds today was talking about the people that look after those animals. And actually to have happy, healthy animals, you need happy, healthy people as well around them. Biosecurity is a huge challenge to us in this country as well and globally. Food security has come into sharp focus with the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, about resilience, about our food supply chains. And producing food whilst also looking after the environment. The two are not mutually exclusive, and that's a key challenge. And also then the economics of livestock farming as well. In terms of giving you the parliamentary perspective, with animal health and welfare. There are bills, both primary and secondary, that we scrutinise that go through Parliament. There are select committees. I sat in the last Parliament on the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. There are APPGs. There are questions that you can ask to the government of the day in departments and to the Prime Minister. So those of you who are politically aware, you'll see a change in the dynamics of these photographs. So that was me asking a question at Prime Minister's question time in the previous Parliament. So you'll see a lot of those faces are not members of Parliament anymore. And now this was this session, me asking a question at parliamentary question times. And you'll note this chap sat next to me on the back benches, Rishi Sunak. And that was a very humbling experience to be asking a question to the Prime Minister of the day, Sir Keir Starmer, having the former Prime Minister sat next to me. And in answer to your questions, is Rishi a good guy? Yes. Is Keir a good guy? Yes. Those people who step up to take the ultimate role in politics to keep us all safe, I think they deserve our maximum respect for the sacrifices they make for their lives and their families in public service. So anyway, there's front bench scrutiny as well. So now I'm a Shadow DEFRA Minister asking questions of the government of the day, the DEFRA department as well. So that's to give you a little bit of the political perspective. Some of the bills that have gone through Parliament in recent years, the Agriculture Act in 2020, in terms of how that's influenced farm animal welfare, there's the Animal Health and Welfare Pathway, where people can sign up to veterinary care, and I think that's so important as well. The Sentencing Act in terms of trying to tackle animal cruelty. The Animal Welfare Sentience Act, so formally recognising in UK legislation that animals are sentient beings, and setting up the Animal Sentience Committee so that when the government of the day pass bills, you have to pay due regard to animal welfare. So I think farm animals will benefit from that. The Genetic Technology, the Precision Breeding Act in terms of gene editing technology to try and develop climate-resistant, disease-resilient crops, but also animals and birds that are disease-resistant as well. So these are some of the diseases that I know the Roslin Institute are working on in terms of avian influenza and also PRRS as well. That will be a benefit to those animals and also to public health and the environment. The animal welfare livestock exports ban in terms of banning the export of animals for fattening and slaughter. And then in the last Parliament, the Kept Animals Bill, where many different aspects of animal welfare were bagged together in a huge bill. That got carved up in the end and is now being delivered in the last Parliament and this Parliament with private members' bills. So just last week, we passed at Bill Committee the pet smuggling bill. So I was the first vet elected since 1884. So vets in Parliament are a bit like London buses. You wait 120 years, wait another 5 years, and then another one pops along. So I was delighted to support the Honourable Member for Winchester, Danny Chambers, in this bill as well. And so it's just gone through Bill Committee last week. So the select committees can actually then scrutinise the legislation. That's very important. Delighted that James actually was an expert witness for us in terms of our mental health, our rural mental health report that we did. But we've done reports in the last Parliament on food security, but also scrutinised international trade deals as well. So that's something that's very much in the spectrum now, is looking at international trade deals. So a lot of publicity recently about the American trade deal. In the Australian and New Zealand trade deals, with opposition and cross-party support, we managed to push the government of the day to insert animal welfare chapters into the Australian and New Zealand trade deals. And that's what we're trying to do in these new deals coming through. But big debates about we must stand firm with our red lines in this country. And very much that's so important that things that are illegal for our farmers to do in this country, and in terms of the food production, chlorine-washed poultry, ractopamine-treated pork, hormone-treated beef, bovine somatotropin-treated dairy products, and also the use of antibiotics as growth promoters. It's so important that we as a country keep them as our red lines, that if we expect our farms to farm to the highest standard, the food that we import must meet those standards as well. Biosecurity is one of the big challenges as well, and that's something that I take very seriously in my shadow ministerial role, is really trying to push the government of the day to make sure that the APHA, and I know we've got people from the APHA in the audience today, is funded adequately. The APHA HQ in Weybridge needs a full redevelopment. So the previous government committed 1.2 billion. It needs 2.8 billion. The current government have committed 208. So we are putting pressure on them to produce the rest because it's so important. When we've got international threats, we've had foot and mouth disease in Germany, Slovakia and Hungary just this year. So it's so important that we support biosecurity. Our mental health report as well talked about the people working in this sector. So the vets, the farmers, the agricultural workers. And the report that we found, I instigated that report on the select committee, and James was a really powerful witness to us on that, about the pressures that vets in the front line are facing and farmers, what they're facing. Some of the challenges that they're facing. So farmers who are farming to the highest standard, they also then get beaten up by the public, that it's their cows that are contributing to climate change. And that takes a toll on farmers as well. They have issues in their communities in terms of lack of mobile phone signal, lack of broadband. They have financial problems as well in terms of the governments of the day challenging them with their finances as well. And then they have these shock events, foot and mouth to name one, but things like avian influenza is with us now. And then we've got threats coming in from internationally as well. And then those chronic stresses as well. So it's so important that we think about prevention as well as support. This small picture here, you can see there, that is talking about suicide prevention, where I was able to take in a group of bereaved fathers who are campaigning for suicide prevention in the school curriculum. They lost their daughters tragically to suicide. And so Rishi answered the PMQ and said, would he meet with them? And he met with them. And I've asked the same question of Keir, and he's going to be meeting with them as well. So some of these issues in terms of mental health, animal health and welfare, they unite us in humanity across the House of Commons. And it's so important that we stand up for those sectors. So thank you for your attention. This final slide really is to show you that we've got to the end, but also in terms of happy, healthy animals, we need to have happy, healthy people around them. And it's important for all of us as people in this sector that we actually, like my dog, have some outside interests that keep us happy. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Neil. I'm now delighted to introduce James Russell, who's Assistant Clinical Professor at the University of Nottingham and also Non-Executive Director of DEFRA. So James graduated from the RVC in 2002 and was involved as a student in the national effort to control foot and mouth disease in 2001. James initially worked in Essex before moving up to practice in Uttoxeter, and over there his interest in infectious disease control developed, seeing him coordinate regional BVD control schemes, as well as being amongst the early advocates of controlling the controllable with bovine TB. James is also a veterinary director at Red Tractor. So over to you, James.
Thanks ever so much. And those of you who are observant of the timetable for today will have seen that I was parachuted in at sort of quite the last moment to do this. And I felt less bad about that when I found out the person I was replacing is out celebrating with a young man from South London, a guy called Ebreke Eze. If you're not with your football trivia, he's the man who stopped Manchester City winning the FA Cup at the weekend. So there we are. So we'll have a quick walk through this. And, you know, I think as Beth introduced me there, really, I suppose I'm here with two different hats on today, the Animal Health and Welfare Board for England, but also Assured Farm Standards. Asking this question of whether we can complement animal health and welfare with economics. And it's always important to sort of get my headline message out at the start. And I'm going to say yes. So let's see where we go with it. And I think we can look at this through our 5 domains model. We've heard about this already today, and I think it's a great hook for us to sort of think about how we're going to approach whether we are achieving our health and welfare objectives and whether we can do that in an economically sustainable and viable way for the future of the country. So we're going to use this model. We're also going to think about what are the tools which are currently available to us. And, you know, it would be wrong of me, I think, not to mention animal health and welfare pathway in this because, you know, for the first time, we've got a situation where state money is putting vets on farm purely to go there and have a look at the health and welfare status of those farms, to support them with biosecurity planning, to support them with making some priority plans for their farm and their business, but also to put some downward pressure on endemic diseases. And we are moving towards a situation where we will have mandatory endemic disease control for the first time. And these are not insubstantial amounts of money to be thinking that we're going to have to be able to go and investigate some of those endemic diseases on farms. So this is here, this is what we're doing now. And I just thought, how does that fit in around our 5-domain model? Well, we've had the welfare grants. We had them a couple of years ago. There's another round of them at the moment. Quite a lot of money has been given out under those welfare grants, whether that's through calf housing, where I think we've given out something like 17 million quid to farmers in order to try and improve their housing. We're currently looking at that from a poultry perspective as well, and thinking about poultry biosecurity. One of the things that we recognise is that avian influenza has got into some of our highest biosecurity units. Well, in that case, the biosecurity isn't good enough, is it? So we do need to do something a little bit better than we have done. So we're looking at all of that at the moment. We're also looking in the pig sector at where we are with options for farrowing and how we can support moves towards confinement, or reduced confinement. And I was delighted to be at BVA Council a few weeks ago when we were able to approve the BVA position on farrowing confinement as well. So I would say that our welfare grants have perhaps hit those two aspects of our 5 domains model. But also, as part of that animal health and welfare pathway, we've got, as I've already said, this annual vet visit, a vet on farm thinking about the different aspects of the farm. And I'm going to say it ticks all 4 of those boxes, because we are out there looking at that physical environment, yes, from a biosecurity point of view, but also making some health and welfare-based advisory decisions which will be impacted upon by the physical environment on the farm. Nutrition, I think we would just take as a read really here, because we can't be having high health and high welfare animals if their nutrition is poor. So inevitably, it's part of what we look at when we're on farm, considering the whole herd or the whole flock. Under health, we've talked about endemic disease control already, but there's so much more to it as well, and opportunities to think about what needs to be improved on that farm in terms of setting specific priorities bespoke to that farm for the next year. So we've got that under health. Behavioural interactions, I think we can think of in many different ways. And the way I thought about this a little bit is, for the first time for some of these farmers, we're starting to support them in terms of improving the approach that they're taking to their livestock. And I think that, in and of itself, can be a great behavioural interaction improvement on farm. We know the data that says if you name your cows, it's worth 500 litres a year. And it's not because they like being called Flossie, is it? It's because we know that when we're doing that, we actually change the way that we interact with our animals, and we improve it, and we improve their welfare in doing it. So all of those, I'm going to say, contributing towards the positive and improved mental state of our animals. And is this working? Yes, it is. Of the pathway visits so far carried out, 95% of the farmers surveyed have said they either have or are intending to implement the changes and the recommendations made by the vet. So the vet is central. My thesis here, the vet is central to making sure that we deliver high health and welfare on farm. And I've already mentioned mandatory disease control, and I think that fits into some of these boxes as well. We've got 2 years, guys, just as a bit of a heads up on this one. We've got 2 years really now before this mandatory disease control looks like being a reality. I would be using that time, if I were in practice at the moment, to take advantage of the funding which is available while this is a voluntary scheme. Because I wouldn't like to be the vet explaining to my farmers in 2 years' time why I didn't get them that funding for these 2 years, and now they're being told they have to do something and the funding isn't there for it. So let's get out there and let's actually get involved in this. So I'm going to say then, we've got a policy in place at the moment that helps support the 5 domains of welfare. And we've got the monitoring system to ensure that, that the farmers are doing what they said they're going to do. I'd like to tie it together under sort of one health banner and say all of those aspects that I've just talked about contribute positively to both human and environmental health as well. but also we're trying to think about one welfare as well as one health. And I'm going to say, although the corollary is not necessarily true, we certainly can't have a high welfare animal that is unhealthy. So we can bring welfare into our One Health definition as well. So, jumping on then to how we assure that, and I apologise in advance really for the fact that these slides are slightly promotional, are red tractor slides, but I wanted to use them to highlight some of the points that we're trying to make today. So, within this, I'm not going to talk to all of it, but it's worth remembering where we've come from, I think, with farm assurance. First sort of launched in 2000 as a result of the complete breakdown, really, in trust of British food after the salmonella in eggs and then BSE. And where are we now? We're in a position that that logo is appearing on £16 billion worth of food produce sold in the UK, and it's supported and assured by ISO accredited standards. And it's recognised as well. It's recognised by consumers. So 60% of consumers will say that the red tractor is the thing that gives them the information they need to be able to trust the food that they're buying. So, to come back to the original question, can we ally these things? Yes, I think we can. We've got legislation to put vets on farm delivering health and welfare advice, and that advice is being valued and acted upon. We've got assurance marks for our food, which consider all aspects of food production, and these marks are trusted both at home and abroad, increasingly important as we move into an environment of more trade deals. And we've got the financial and legislative backing to deliver these disease reduction programs in our livestock. And those programs have survived the budget review process. That wasn't a certainty when we went through this in the last few months, but the value of them to UK PLC as well as to animal health and welfare has been recognised. So if I was to summarise that slide, I might say that we've built a really shiny house here for us to... In fact, no, I'd go further than that. I think we may have built a glass castle. And if you haven't seen where I'm going with this, I think it's even one better. I think we've built a crystal palace.
Thank you, James. So we're now going to move over to our Q&A discussion. I see a few of you have already made your way over to Slido, but feel free to drop your questions in there. We'll also take questions from the audience and people in the room as well. If you'd like to stick your hands up and we can send a roving mic round. I can see you shut up straight away.
Claire Roberts, Cats Protection. But this question is my own, does not reflect Cats Protection's opinion in any way, caveat. We had a brilliant session this morning on extreme breeding in companion animals, and I think most people would agree that many of our farm animals are bred to extremes, some a lot more than others. And, you know, the discussion this morning was, are we complicit in the suffering of tens of thousands of purebred dogs, brachycephalics? Are we complicit in the suffering of millions and billions of farm animals who've been bred this way? And we can give them all the disease control and all the perches in the world, but they're going to be suffering just from their lack of innate health.
Happy to start on that, if you like.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really fair question, and I was sitting here listening to that session this morning, thinking about, you know, where we've been in terms of, you know, Belgian blue caesareans, for example, and when you have to move to the right flank because there's no more left flank to undertake caesareans on, and where are we in terms of complicit behaviour with that? But I think what we should recognise is the moves that are being made both by industry but also by supported through some of the schemes that we've been discussing to get us away from there. And I think back to when I graduated in 2002, the average dairy heifer at that point didn't start her second lactation. And you know, the reasons for that are really clear. We'd bred for these narrow-chested, tall Canadian Holsteins because they gave us most milk, but they fell off their feet and never recovered. We've moved hugely from there. Have we got a long way to go? Yes, we have got a long way to go. We have got a long way to go. I think the last time I looked at it, we were now just over 3.25 or something like that, lactations now on average. So we have got a long way to go. But we're moving in the right direction, and we're moving there through a sort of voluntary recognition from industry that this is the right thing for them to do for their livestock, but also the right thing for them to do for the sustainability of their business. And I would point to some of the things that are being discussed at the moment around precision breeding to say this is something that we need to be cautious about. We need to recognise the risks inherent in it, but we also need to embrace, if we're serious about thinking how can we maximise the positive behaviour traits that we know we need to encourage. And that might feel counterintuitive, I think, when we've had a conversation this morning about breeding for smaller and smaller genetic pools. So I think there's a challenge for us to overcome there, but we must face it and we must meet it, because I agree with you, we need to make further progress.
I would completely agree with James on that, and there's more that we can do, but I think we should also, again, it comes back to the supporting the people who are working in this, that our farmers in this country are very aware of these issues, and they're very proud about their animal health and welfare standards. Yes, they want to do more, but I think if we contrast that, if I come back to the point about international trade deals, when you have jurisdictions that allow the use of antibiotics as growth promoters or hormones to actually accelerate growth, things like bovine somatotropin actually increases the incidence of mastitis by about 25%. So you're pushing the cows really hard. So that's why in this country it is banned. So I think we need to say that we can always improve on that, but actually acknowledge what is being done. And to back up James's point about the Precision Breeding Act as well, that technology to actually help make birds and animals more resilient and resistant to disease will stop them having to have so many medicines. That's good for the environment, good for the animal health and welfare as well. So the direction of travel is moving positively.
Thank you. I've got a question on Slido here, which I think kind of nicely follows on from that discussion, and I guess what you've both presented as well. So thinking about kind of the different assurance schemes that we have in place, thinking about these, should we and can we improve the schemes and the labelling that we have on our current animal products?
I could answer that one with one word, really. Yes, but but I think where we're at the moment, there is one thing holding us back at the moment, I think, from being able to make significant strides forward in this, and it's the Livestock Identification Transformation Programme, isn't it? LITP. At the moment, I find this staggering in 2025 that we're still in a position of people needing to fill in sort of paper passports for their animals and not being able to trace what's happened to those animals over their life in terms of medications they've received, diseases they've had, all the rest of it. I think once we get that opens the door really for us to be able to do an awful lot more in terms of improving the assurances we're able to give, improving those marks, and also giving consumers greater confidence. Beyond that, you'll be aware that there's a recent farm assurance review that was commissioned by NFU, HDB, and a couple of others. And that looks at the future of assurance and asks what is the purpose of assurance in the future. We are still waiting at Red Tractor for our ownership body to come out with their thoughts on what the future of assurance is. So if you ask me the question again in 10 days, I might be able to give you some more information.
I think, I think can we do more? Yes, I think the public really wants to know the provenance of their food so they can make informed decisions. And in Parliament, we've tried to put a bit of scrutiny on that in terms of some of the big supermarkets that have sort of farm brands. And actually, when you drill down, the actual name of the farm is actually a bit sort of esoteric as well. So I think people need to be aware of what they're buying. But then some people say, well, labelling is the answer. Let the market decide. And so chlorine-washed poultry could be imported, and if it's, as long as it's labelled, the British consumer can decide. I don't concur with that, because that's where I think we do need some red lines. But we do need transparency as to people knowing exactly the provenance of their food. But there are certain things like chlorine-washed poultry, we just have to say, no, that is a red line from that.
I think that's a really nice point, and I think this echoes, I'm going to say, some polite discussions we've had at work in relation to this. So I spent a lot of time working with a lot of economists who obviously talk a lot about the free market, and that actually the market should be left to itself to give us the appropriate standard of animal welfare. That's what markets are for. But I guess to what extent should that demand be there? And I guess thinking about the conversations we've already had about social license, and to what extent, I guess, does policy, legislation, farm assurance need to think about having those minimum standards and driving up those minimum standards as well?
I think that term minimum standards is very important, and I think that's something, if that can be inserted into, say, I keep coming back to international trade negotiations, but if minimum standards can be put in, but then you have the assurance schemes and the labelling side beyond that. But coming back to the point about should the market decide, I think something, I keep coming back to chlorine-washed poultry, what that does is hide substandard bird welfare upstream. So I think we need to be sort of clear about that. But I think the assurance schemes really help, but they need to be looked at and evaluated to see if they are working moving forward.
And I think there's a broader piece, isn't there, in terms of our food security and protection of our food security around this as well, and in terms of how we try and encourage consumer choice to be, in terms of making these decisions to buy stuff which is assured, potentially which is homegrown, and if not, at least that we understand what it is that's coming in. And African swine fever will come at some point, and it will come because somebody brings some pork products across, the channel. That will be how it arrives here. The Port of Dover seized nearly 100 tons of illegal pork products in January alone. It's absolutely phenomenal. And why is that happening? It's happening because we're able to get these foods into the country potentially more cheaply than we can produce them at home, because we haven't got the controls in place to make sure that we're not offshoring our reduced animal welfare. So I think absolutely agree with Neil's point, and we're going to manage that, I think, aren't we, by making sure that we do keep our borders secure and keep food security top of our agenda.
Just following up on that, in terms of our standards, what that potentially can do with sort of British soft power is actually, if you say to people, if you want to trade with us, your standards have to meet ours, we will then be indirectly, hopefully, improving animal health and welfare standards in different countries. So I think there's a win-win for global animal health and welfare if we stay firm on those lines.
Yes, I think we've got a question on the left and a question on the right.
Oh, sorry.
Amy.
It's Amy Jackson from University of Nottingham Vet School. I'm social science, not a vet, just to caveat that. I think this is a really interesting discussion. I'd like to go back to the audience member from the Cats Protection League. Really interesting question is, how do we improve farm animal welfare when it's cost prohibitive and uncompetitive? We've found that farmers, especially at the moment, are really struggling to pay for improvements on farm. We know that the public, Beth, you know particularly, won't pay for it because they tend to default to the lowest cost items. We know the government doesn't want food price inflation as well. And we have situations, for example, we have slower growing chicken breeds, but then there are challenges with both making them economically viable and also environmental impact in terms of carbon emissions. So we have all these trade-offs. So how do we actually improve welfare with all these barriers? Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. It's a tricky one.
I think you want to try and reduce some of the barriers, and I thought about today coming to you as a vet who's gone into Parliament, and I didn't really want to get sort of party political. But farmers over many, many years, with different governments in power, face difficult economic climates. And I think they're facing a really harsh climate now. For instance, I'll give you the example of the inheritance tax policy. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on farms. And you would argue that, yeah, farmers have had challenges in the past. So I think we need to, if we are genuinely serious about food security for our country, and we have the values that we strongly believe that the British consumer, our values say that we want those animals to be farmed to a high animal health and welfare standard, then the government of the day has to put in the legislative framework so that the environment for those farmers to put the food on our tables, to make us more resilient in global situations that are challenging, the government of the day has to make that environment suitable so that the farmers and the vets and everyone involved in the food production chain stays in that sector, and we are not then offshoring to something cheaper and substandard overseas.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Amy, and we could spend the rest of today on this one easily, couldn't we? But I think I would pull us back to the animal health and welfare pathway and what we're trying to achieve there. It's not by accident that BVD and PRRS ended up in there as our cattle and pig disease. Slightly different situation with where we are on the sheep side. But the reason those two ended up in there is because actually we can make an economic case for controlling them, as well as animal health and welfare, environmental, productivity, all the rest of it, case for it. And so someone's already used the phrase win-win today and this afternoon, and I think that's where we are, isn't it? Is saying we know that if we can improve health through reduction of endemic disease, we can improve welfare through then potentially lower stocking rates, greater longevity, all those sorts of aspects of life that we might start to look at, that we can actually make that stack up to be more profitable for our farmers than the status quo. And just the numbers on BVD are quite staggering, really, aren't they, in terms of the numbers of tens of millions of pounds that's costing the cattle industry. So I think probably that's the way that we go about it, is that we say wherever we try to support our farmers with increased pressure on them to do something different, we've got to make sure that we've put also in place an environment where it remains economically sustainable for them as well. It's where we've ended up, isn't it, with this quite long lead-in period to the reduction in confinement around farrowing systems. We've got the evidence now that actually this can be really good, but investing in that infrastructure is going to take a lot of confidence from the farming sector. I hope we can do it more quickly than the 15 years that BVA have allowed us for it. But it will take some time, and it's going to be an iterative process.
Thank you very much. At risk of putting my head above the parapet, Deborah Alexander from APHA. I'd be very interested in the panel's view on our current state of biosecurity nationally for the import of live animals. For some while I've worked in the border control post area, and the governments have introduced a business target operating model which instigates levels of check post-Brexit, if people aren't aware, for plant products and for the importation of products, as we call it, anything that's got an animal origin in it. But the last part of that chapter is live animal checks, which are now very firmly on hold. And the current thinking appears to be that potentially this will be resolved by some point of destination checks in a very overstretched field-based operation at the moment with blue tongue and avian influenza and endemic disease. Do you really find that a realistic option? Are you reassured by this approach? And with the timely and sad outbreak of foot and mouth in Europe, and having personally been involved in that in the last devastating outbreak in 2000, it's not something I'm personally very reassured about. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and that harking back to the 2001 foot and mouth outbreak is the reason why I took the decision that year to, as a vet, people say, why on earth have you gone into politics? It was my experiences in the front line during that crisis that sites I saw that year involved in the sort of disease, supervising the disease I'll never want to see again in my lifetime. So that's why, you know, if you follow at all some of the things that we do in Parliament, every time I get up at DEFRA questions, the B word comes up. And it's biosecurity for me, and I keep putting pressure on the government of the day. So I did it as a backbencher in the last Parliament, and I do it as a frontbencher, as an opposition frontbencher. In answer to your question, am I comfortable at the moment with the state of our biosecurity? No, I'm not. And I think the border target operator model, I think, does need to be improved. Obviously, there are bigger discussions at the moment about the reset of the relationship with the European Union, and that may well have impacts on what we do. But the fact that the check at Dover is 22 miles inland at Sevington is not ideal. And so one of the things that we keep putting pressure on the government is that you still need to fund the random checks at the ports as well, because as James has alluded to, the amount of illegal food coming in that is seized is huge. So you can imagine the amount that does slip through that is not seen. So we've got to be vigilant on that. And we need to be so strong on biosecurity because that impacts the health of our animals, but also indirectly the health of the people working in that sector. We are still living with the shockwaves of the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001. And so when we got foot and mouth in Slovakia, Hungary and Germany this year, the mental health shockwaves that we felt in this country, and as James has said, if African swine fever came in, it would be equally catastrophic. So are we doing enough? No. So we need to keep pushing hard on this.
Did you read my notes before you gave that answer?
My eyesight's not that good.
But no, I think that I don't want to repeat what Neil has just said, but I do support all of it. But I think the other thing then that I might just add to it would be to say that's our aspiration, isn't it? Is to do better than we have been doing in terms of our border controls. But we are where we are today, and I think that really reinforces for me the importance of what we do as vets in practice as the first line of disease surveillance, and recognising when new and re-emerging threats are occurring, recognising changes in disease pattern that we're seeing on farm, in our small animal clinics, at equine stable yards, wherever we may be working. A massively important role for us as veterinary surgeons, and one that I think your question really comes to the nub of. I can't remember the stats, so I won't try and quote it, about how much less financially costly the foot and mouth outbreak of 2001 would have been had it been identified 24 hours earlier. But it's staggering. It's staggering. And that's what we do, isn't it? That's us.
We've got a question at the front over here.
Hello, my name's Charlie. I work at Dogs Trust now, but historically my first job I was a mixed vet in Somerset, largely in dairy. And from my experience, farmers are incredibly passionate about the welfare of their animals, and they care very much, but I think finances has come up a lot. I know it's the title of the talk, and sorry, this is also a Slido question, so you could ignore the Slido question, but they don't lack the capital funds to invest. I used to find this so frustrating, especially when we're talking about old family farms with sheds that are built for cows that don't look like cows look like anymore. They can't make those changes. So we've spoken about, supporting farmers financially and so on, but actually what action can perhaps governments take to actually make that happen? I know there's grants and so on and so forth, but I just find it incredibly frustrating to see supermarkets making massive profits off, and my farmers were missing out on this, and I think that's unjust. We see, in the veterinary, I'm not an economist, right? So can we legislate for that? At the moment, we have the CMA review of small animal practices happening. I don't know if that's something, but I'm just looking for inspiration of ways that we could actually take real action to make sure that our farmers are profiting rather than other people, so that they can reinvest in animal welfare in their businesses.
Yeah, it's incredibly hard for farmers to make a profit. And this is, I come back to the inheritance tax policy. People say, well, farmers are sitting on very valuable assets and land. Yes, they are. But they only realise those assets if they actually sell them. Many farmers are drawing a very, very modest income, 13, 14, 15,000 pounds in some cases. And how can they invest in improving the infrastructure on their farm or investing in their herds or their flocks if the financial climate for them is difficult. In terms of the question about supermarkets, in the last Parliament, the EFRA Select Committee did an inquiry called Fairness in the Food Supply Chain, looking at that very fact about people producing the food, are they given a fair crack of the whip with that? And that's something that if we can put pressure at all stages of the food supply chain so that the producer has a better environment, to then be also supporting them in what they're doing in terms of environmental stewardship and animal health and welfare, then that will improve things.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the question, John. I think it really gets to the root of a lot of this. And I made a couple of slightly different notes here. One is thinking about the supermarkets, and actually very easy for us to paint supermarkets as the bad guy in this one, and don't take away from anything that you've just said, but I think probably also important to recognise that a lot of the sort of farm assurance requirements that have seen us go above and beyond legislative baselines have been led by supermarket requests on the basis that they believe that's what their consumers want, and it gives them a competitive edge, let's be honest, to be able to say, our milk comes from happy farms. Is where they're at, isn't it? So I think we probably do need to recognise the role that they're having in trying to drive that forward as well. We can argue about the pace of it. But I think the other thing I would come back to is what government can do more of, what we've already started to try and do. The next round of welfare grants that go out on farm are going to have quite a weighting in the way that they're marked, the way that they're scored in that sort of competitive tender process. If the thing that is being applied for, the bit of money you want, actually featured in the vet's advice for that farm as part of the animal health and welfare pathway review visit. So we're actually just putting the vet back at the centre of saying, you, with the farmer, make the decisions about what's needed for health and welfare, and government then will be supportive of that with a grant, and will give some weight to the fact that a vet has advised it. So I think it comes back for me to vets at the centre of health and welfare.
I think there's a few different questions that have come in through Slido, and also I think touching upon Amy's question before, in that we know that food is very expensive for a lot of people. So I'm in Newcastle, we've got one of the largest food banks in the country, but there's also a lot of evidence and studies to show that animal products are actually too cheap. So how do we ensure that food stays affordable, but also that producers can still make a profit? Sorry for that question. The golden question.
I think that's a really tough one. I think one of the sort of take-homes from this morning, that one of the key words was education, wasn't it? And I think talking to the public about where their food comes from, how it is produced, and that actually if you want to support your local economy and you want high animal health and welfare, buying locally sourced, reared, slaughtered food is much better than actually having it shipped around the world. And I think if people realise that, but then a cost comes to that, but then it's a direction of travel. And we are in a situation now where families are facing really tough choices in terms of their household budgets. So actually going to the supermarket and seeing the cheapest food is something that many people, not through their own choice, will have to go down that path. So I think that's something that the government of the day has to be cognizant of, that we need to have affordable food, but actually if we can support our farmers in this country to be supporting it with high animal health and welfare and high environmental standards, and support that local economy to try and then hopefully the costs will come down a bit. That's a long-term goal, but these are sort of tough times, but I think informed decisions for the consumer is important as well.
Yeah. And I would say, I don't think there is an easy answer to this one, but I really don't. And it, like many of those challenging questions, therefore, will come down to multiple parts to the solution, won't it? We know that percentage spend on food, if you compare it back, 50, 60 years, in terms of household income, has dropped dramatically. but that's not because people are now sitting on piles of money, it's because there's so many other demands on their resources as well. So I think that's one thing to sort of bear in mind when we're thinking about making sure that this remains profitable for our producers as well. And so maybe I would wonder, perhaps if we are invested in the idea of food security through the mechanism of increasing from the sort of 60-odd% of national food intake, if you like, that we produce at the moment, if we are invested in the idea of improving that, maybe we think that's a public health good, a public good, and therefore might attract some sort of public support in the future. So that might be one way, thinking about how do we actually use our subsidies a little bit better for this. But then I think there's perhaps also some bits around education, aren't there? And I would look at our pig production, where we are almost balanced in terms of pig imports and pig exports at the moment. And why do we import and export a similar weight of pork meat? It's because we don't eat the whole pig. We export some cuts and we import other cuts from other countries. So what could we do then in terms of greater education, greater support for making sure that we're better able to utilise the food that we have grown and developed? Be another question.
That's a really good point. And I think, just coming back to your public good question, just to selfishly put in my own research. So I have done some research looking at, do the public think animal health and welfare is a public good? And it is overwhelmingly, generally very positive. They do see a support for taxpayers' money in that way, which I think is largely a good thing based on some of the conversations we've been having. But I think in terms of education as well, there's not a lot of farming, food, in general education in the UK curriculum, so from a young age. Do you think that's something that needs to change?
Yes.
That's a nice, easy question.
Yeah.
I like that sort of answer.
Have you got more questions you want to go on to? But yes, I think if the young people today can realise where their food comes from and how it is produced, and that actually that going and buying it locally is a good thing for your local community, but also for the animals on the farms, that they're not having to be shipped far to be slaughtered and that side of things. Yes, and I think that's really important. And then those young people will then, we also need to think about the future of our farming. We need to, the government of the day needs to look at the land-based education system and make sure that these young kids that then hear about it at school want to go into that sector. Because I come back to my point about mental health. There are many people that we know as vets that have left the veterinary profession because they just want to get out in terms of the struggles that they've had. And in the farming sector, that is the same situation. So the young people that we're telling about where their food comes from, we want some of them to go in and actually go into that sector to produce the food that we eat, to look after the environment that we so enjoy and we nurture and we treasure. And I think that's so important.
Brilliant, thank you. I have a question at the back.
Thank you very much. I would just like to pose the question of, I'm sure we're not going to talk about Birmingham and its rubbish situation, but Birmingham and its chicken mile, where you go there and buy a chicken and it has no real, you don't know where it's come from, it's just being flogged as chicken. We see adverts on the television now which is make the chicken so remote from the animal it is. How are we going to convince the public to spend more money? Because we don't, on their food. I think we've been skirting around the issue. We have got to get the public to realise that welfare quality means money, and farmers can't. I'm sure any farmer would be happy to reduce the number of animals and have double the money for them. How do we get this, how do we move this on?
I think that's a tough one, but I think coming back to James's point about the way that the funding system has changed now that we've left the European Union in terms of change from the land-based subsidy to now public money for public goods, and whether those public goods are animal health and welfare, whether they're flood prevention, biodiversity, that side of thing. The actual production of food, I think acknowledging that as a public good and generating some funding within that would help within that. But that's a very difficult sell in terms of moving, because otherwise you're then thinking you're moving down the full subsidised thing. But I think production, now that we are so concerned about food security, having the concept that food production is a public good is something that could be acknowledged moving forward?
Really short answer. I'd have a look at the BVA statement around less and better.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lovely question in the chat that should we be talking about the elephant in the room of should we be
We shouldn't be eating elephant.
not eating elephants. I've not heard a lot of feedback on what that tastes like, but thinking about should we just be eating less animal products to begin with? Would that be a solution to the less but better? It's not.
There is an argument on a public health basis, an environmental basis, and an animal health basis. Almost sounds like I've thought about a One Health answer there, doesn't it? To say that we should be considering where our proteins come from. But I think what's really important is that we do have that conversation really honestly about what the impacts of it are likely to be. And if we simply say, we're going to eat more soy, that we think about the impact of that, both in terms of what's imported, but also if we begin to think about more homegrown plant-based proteins, how do we maintain soil structure and soil quality and all of those sorts of things that we know animal agriculture contributes to as well. So I think it's a really important point for us to pick up on, something we probably do need to do, well, we do need to do better at. But I think at the moment we're in a situation where there are two camps on this, and there's so little kind of common ground between them that having a sensible conversation about what that policy looks like, I think, is a little bit challenging in the current environment.
I think we've got time for one last question. Sorry, we will be around at the end. So it was just at the front here.
Oh, hi, yeah, Caroline Allen. This is very much my own personal view. My question has already been answered, which, we haven't talked about eating less. So it's supposed to get a little bit more specific, talking about food as a public good. Where I live, the shops, the fast food that I see, is the fried chicken, the bacon, the ultra-produced ham, is that really a public good? Do we actually need to be really challenging in some of these discussions about, what sort of food system we want, what is a public good? I think, that does include a lot less meat. I think, the argument about soy, most of that soy goes into animal food. And, what does it look like as a public good for us to have a farming system that did work for everyone?
We've got that with 11 seconds left.
I know, I was going to say, good luck answering that in 10 seconds.
Ultimately, you're right, but that's a massive public education piece, isn't it? Which is where that can come from. And I would argue that as vets working in the system at the moment, what we can do is try and make sure that the health and welfare on the farms that we're working with is maximised. If that means fewer stock on those farms, then that might begin to exert some market forces on some of the more convenience foods. That might be one of the solutions to that. I'm not sure that as vets we can lead the entire public argument.
The tricky one. So I think that ends our time for our discussion on the panel today. So thank you for everyone for their questions and for some challenging questions within that as well. So thank you very much. And thank you to our lovely speakers and panelists, Neil and James. We have one more lightning talk before the session breaks for the afternoon break. So I'm delighted to welcome Huw Golledge, who's Chief Executive Officer and Scientific Director at the Humane Slaughter Association and the University Federation for Animal Welfare to the stage. So Huw is going to talk to us about carbon dioxide and should it be replaced as a method for stunning in pigs.
That's right.
Okay.
Perfect.
Slide showing round.
Yep. Is that on the screen yet? Okay. Thank you very much, and apologies for being the one who spoilt all the seamless presentations up to now. So when I heard there was a session on farm animal welfare and economics and questions about the social license to operate, it was almost impossible to not ask to talk about an issue which is very close to the heart of the organisation that I lead, the Humane Slaughter Association, which is the continued use of carbon dioxide to slaughter pigs. So, of course, that doesn't work because it's not plugged into my computer. 90% of pigs, or slightly over 90% now in the UK, are killed with carbon dioxide. And yet we've known in excess of 30 years that it's not humane. Carbon dioxide causes pain, breathlessness, and panic to any mammal which you expose to high concentrations of it. That was published in the mid-1990s from research done earlier than that by Mohan Raj and Neville Gregory and others at the University of Bristol. The same research showed that using argon to stun pigs was both more humane and could effectively stun them. And yet we're still here 30 years later stunning pigs with carbon dioxide. As I'll explain a bit later, I think eventually we now have reached the point where change is on the horizon. But as well as explaining why I think that's the case, I wanted to ask why it's taken so long and how can we avoid that happening again with other animal welfare issues. So it wasn't because there wasn't pressure for change. The Farm Animal Welfare Committee, as it then was, took this on board. In 2003, they said CO2 should be phased out. The Europeans were on the same page. It wasn't that. What I think it probably was that a lot of people, and I don't exempt the Humane Slaughter Association entirely from this, were persuaded that it was impractical, that the meat quality was going to be unacceptable, that it was going to just cost too much money, that we'd have to rebuild all our abattoirs from scratch, that we wouldn't be able to get the argon to kill pigs with. And basically the conclusion was it just can't be done on a practical basis, or at best, more research was needed. And actually, I mean, that's the route that the HSA went down. We funded research into other alternatives that we hoped would be more practical alongside DEFRA. Sadly, they weren't more humane, it turned out, when we did the research. So we're back now to argon. And luckily, I think there is reason to hope that we will see change in less than the next 30 years. Work funded in Europe, initially by the German government, latterly by the EU, done in Germany, has now shown that you can retrofit an existing carbon dioxide stunner in a commercial abattoir to use argon. As we predicted, and we knew in 1995, it drastically reduces poor welfare. The missing pieces of the puzzle are now in place are that we know it's cheap and practical to implement. It costs something like 50,000 euros to convert an abattoir to run with argon, which is a really small amount of money in this scenario. And crucially, the meat quality is within acceptable range. I still think progress could stall. It will cost more money because the throughput in these abattoirs will be somewhat lower. And for that reason, I suspect the push to actually make this a reality will have to come from government proposing to phase out the use of CO2 rather than it happening organically. But I think it will happen eventually. And by government, I don't just mean the UK. It would be nice to see action from Europe too, ideally in some kind of coordinated fashion so that we don't encounter all sorts of trade issues. And really at the end, I just wanted to use this as a sort of example of how we could do better in future. How do we ensure that, you know, really important fundamental animal welfare research translates into practice, again, in less than 3 decades? Therefore, I think it's essential we fund the implementation bit. The D of research and development needs to be in there as well as the basic research so that things don't stall over questions of practicality. And we need to challenge and test assumptions that things are impractical, that are genuine welfare improvements, rather than taking them at face value all the time when there's no substantive data to back that up. We shouldn't allow perfection to be the enemy of the good. Using argon to stun pigs might not be the best way to do it, but it's very clearly much better than the way we do it at the moment. So we should make the progress we can make. And really crucially, I think we need to establish and maintain constructive dialogue between stakeholders. This field of slaughter in particular is incredibly siloed. Primary producers don't talk to the supermarkets as much as they should. They don't talk to the scientists. We don't talk to government. The NGOs should be in this discussion as well. And I think if we had a forum like this, but for the people who are actually involved in the slaughter industry, many of whom, of course, are veterinarians, we might be able to challenge those assumptions and work out ways around them in ways that we don't if everyone is not talking to each other directly. So that's my final plea, I think, for a really constructive dialogue around these tricky welfare issues. Thank you very much.
Time for a couple of questions. I saw one hand straight up at the back over there.
Anna Judson, BVA Senior Vice President. I just wanted to say if everybody here wants to see an awful lot of what we've been just talking about this afternoon pushed at higher levels, don't forget to maintain your BVA membership, because having spent nearly 3 years now with a lot of the agricultural portfolio falling onto my desk, I am so impressed at what BVA does in support of animal health and welfare across all species, but particularly in the agricultural sector, we do have a voice at many of the senior tables, making a massive influence on animal health and welfare for our farm animals. So just would be remiss of me, as this will be the last one that I attended as a BVA officer, not to remind people of the importance of their BVA membership. It's a phenomenal organisation that does a huge amount of work in this field. Thanks.
Well said. I'm not a vet, but I am an associate member at least.
Huw, I've got a question in the chat for you. So thinking about, you've talked about kind of different ways of enforcing change. Why can't the government just enforce the change to argon in abattoirs, and those that don't comply shut down until any change is made?
In all honesty, it could if it really wanted to. I think, in all fairness, we should start from the place now that we're not going to shut down abattoirs overnight. A transition period is what we should do, and that will drive the change. I think that's the reasonable approach. We can't bankrupt the UK pork industry by closing down its abattoirs, but if we put a reasonable transition period in place, then the industry will have to find a solution. Frankly, you know, we're not starting from scratch anymore, so they can do that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you'd agree or not, but just thinking to a couple of years ago when we had a shortage of CO2 and abattoirs did have to halt their lines for a while, the knock-on health and welfare impacts of that on farm were really quite dramatic and quite rapid, weren't they? So we've got to be really careful that we, you know, the unintended consequences of what might sound like a really good idea.
Interestingly, I will come back on that though. Argon is commercially produced on demand, whereas carbon dioxide is an industrial byproduct. So actually it will provide security for slaughter, which should circumvent that issue.
We've got time for, I think we've got two quick questions, and then we will go for the break.
Thank you. Alice Bruff, pig vet. Huw, why do you think it is that carbon dioxide gassing is now more, the changes on the horizon and more in the public agenda?
There are a whole range. I mean, lots of people have questioned the social license to operate of the pig industry from, you know, very much either all the way from the animal rights argument to less radical questioning of the social license to operate. So there is that, and there is the fact that, you know, it's been clearly shown that we could do something else now. So this is not an abstract, carbon dioxide is bad, but there's no alternative. You know, there's an alternative now, and that's, I think that changes the argument very dramatically.
Just a follow-up on that. It strikes me that it's often the case that we've talked about social license and public education as to where our food comes from. It seems like for some reason it takes activists putting cameras in farms and in gas chambers for any change to come about, and for kind of people to stand up and say that's not ideal. I mean, I'm sure, James, you saw the recent expose, and there are many, and I'm sure it hasn't escaped your notice that every single one of those is red tractor assured. I just think this has been a bit of a strange farm and animal welfare session, because I don't feel like we've really talked that much about the welfare, and there are some very fundamental issues in farmed animal welfare that need addressing. I did a lightning talk a couple of years ago on the pig industry, and I'm glad we're talking about gas chambers, that's one of them. But I wanted to make a point that it would be better coming from the welfare experts and the veterinarians to point out these massively fundamental welfare issues in our farmed industries, rather than saying the public need better education on food systems. We know what's happening, we can see it in the news, we can see it if we work in those industries. Let's just be honest about it.
Should we move on to the next question?
Just Julia, I'm a chicken vet, and I don't really know what to say after that. Thank you. I guess I want something following up with that, maybe on a more positive note. How do you think we can, as I'm a veterinarian, so maybe the veterinary industry or the veterinarians in this room, how can we actually voice towards these, I guess, pigs, chickens, or other industries? How do we voice our concerns, especially for these higher level changes? Because I think on a day-to-day level, it's easy with, okay, there's mortality, we solve it. There's other diseases, we solve it. But these issues that we're talking about here, like which gas we use, I think that's higher level changes. How do you think we can do that, or what advice do you have for us? Thank you.
Well, once again, not a veterinarian, so maybe I'm not the right one to ask, but I think you probably heard the route. It's through your professional organisations. You're welcome to join the Humane Slaughter Association too, and we will voice that for you. You've got the BVA, you've got the political route you heard from Dr. Hudson. I think, make your voice heard. You're an expert, so make it heard through whatever organisation you can use to amplify that.
Thank you very much, Huw.
Thanks.
So that ends our session for this afternoon. So we now have a break. If we could come back at 4:05, and we'll wrap up with the second session of the afternoon.